The morning light on November 12, 1940 revealed something the Italian Navy had never imagined possible. In Taranto harbor, 3 battleships sat crippled. Oil spread across the water in vast dark slicks. Smoke still rose from damaged vessels, and in the headquarters building overlooking the port, Admiral Inigo Campion stared at damage reports that seemed impossible to believe. 21 British aircraft, a single night. The core of Italy's battle fleet shattered. Campion had commanded the Italian naval forces for less than 6 months. Now he held papers documenting a catastrophe. His hands, witnesses would later recall, trembled slightly as he read. Not from fear, from fury mixed with disbelief. The British had done what Italian naval doctrine insisted could never be done. They had struck a heavily defended harbor at night with torpedo bombers and achieved devastating success. The Admiral's first words that morning, according to officers present, were not about the British. They were about the defenses. Where were the nets, he asked. His voice was quiet, dangerous in its control. Where were the fighters? Where were the balloons? No one had good answers. The attack had begun just before 11 the previous night. Most of the harbor's defenders had been eating dinner or preparing for bed. The first wave of British swordfish biplanes had arrived almost undetected. Slow, obsolete-looking aircraft that seemed to belong to an earlier war, but they carried torpedoes modified to run in shallow water, and they were flown by pilots who had trained for months for exactly this mission. By the time Italian gunners fully responded, the first torpedoes were already in the water. By the time the second wave arrived an hour later, the harbor was in chaos. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky. Barrage balloons that should have been deployed weeks earlier floated uselessly in the wrong positions, and 3 of Italy's 6 battleships were taking on water. Now in the gray dawn, Campion had to assess what remained. The Conte Cavour sat on the harbor bottom in shallow water. One torpedo had torn open her hull below the waterline. She had flooded rapidly, settling into the mud with her superstructure still visible above the surface. Engineers were already reporting that repairs would take months, maybe longer. The ship that had been named for one of Italy's founding statesmen now looked like a monument to failure. Worse was the report on the Littorio, Italy's newest, most powerful battleship commissioned just months earlier, hit by 3 torpedoes. The ship hadn't sunk, but the damage was catastrophic. Her forward section was flooded. Her hull was torn open in multiple places. She would need to be towed to dry dock. Months of repairs lay ahead, maybe a year before she could fight again. The Caio Duilio had been beached deliberately to prevent her from sinking. 1 torpedo had struck her stern. She was taking water but still afloat. Barely. Engineers estimated she could be refloated and repaired, but not quickly, not easily. 3 battleships, half of Italy's capital ship strength, gone in a single night. Campion called for his chief of staff. The man arrived within minutes, his uniform hastily buttoned, his face showing the same shock that gripped everyone in the building. "Get me Admiral Riccardi in Rome," Campion said, "and prepare a full damage assessment. I want numbers, exact numbers, casualties, ships, equipment, timeline for repairs, everything." The chief of staff nodded and left. Campion turned back to the window. Below in the harbor, small boats moved between the damaged vessels. Rescue operations had continued through the night. Bodies were still being recovered. The casualty reports were incomplete, but early estimates suggested nearly 60 dead, hundreds wounded, and those numbers might rise as they searched the flooded compartments of the sunken ships. In Rome, Admiral Arturo Riccardi received Campion's call just after 8 in the morning. Riccardi was Chief of Naval Staff, the head of Supermarina, the Italian Navy's high command. He'd spent the night receiving fragmentary reports from Taranto, reports that seemed too catastrophic to be accurate. Now hearing Campion's voice, hearing the controlled fury and the precise damage estimates, Riccardi understood that the reports had been, if anything, understated. 3 battleships, Riccardi repeated, his voice flat. Officers in his headquarters would later describe his reaction as eerily calm, the kind of calm that comes after shock when the mind refuses to fully process what it's hearing. "All 3 out of action. The Conte d'Avour may never fight again. Campion said the later will need extensive repairs. The Delio is salvageable but will take months. We've also lost a cruiser damaged and 2 destroyers hit. The harbor is a mess. Oil everywhere. Unexploded ordnance. And the British only lost 2 aircraft. 2 aircraft against 3 battleships and multiple other vessels damaged. The mathematics of that exchange were devastating." Riccardi thanked Campion and ended the call. Then he sat in silence for several minutes. Officers waited, uncertain what to do. Finally, Riccardi spoke. "Get me the undersecretary," he said, "and prepare a briefing for the Duce. He'll want to know everything." Domenico Cavagnari, the Undersecretary of State for the Navy, was Italy's most senior naval officer. He had held his position since 1933, overseeing the Navy's expansion and modernization. Now he faced the worst naval disaster in Italian history, a disaster that had happened in port in a supposedly secure harbor against a force of obsolete biplanes. When Cavagnari arrived at Supermarina headquarters that morning, witnesses reported that he looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His face was drawn. His movements were stiff. He listened to Ricard's briefing at silence, occasionally asking questions about specific details. How many torpedoes had hit? What was the status of the torpedo nets? Why had the barrage balloons not been properly deployed? The answers were damning. The torpedo nets had only protected part of the harbor. Budget constraints and a belief that the harbor's shallow depth made torpedo attack impossible had led to incomplete defenses. The barrage balloons had been delivered but not fully deployed. Again, the assumption had been that night attack by torpedo bombers was impractical. The anti-aircraft defenses, while numerous, had been poorly coordinated. No one had expected a night attack. No one had trained for it. "They did to us what we should have done to them," Cavagnari said finally. His voice was bitter. "We have the carriers. We have the aircraft. We should have struck Alexandria or Gibraltar first. Instead, we sat in port and let them come to us." It was a recognition that would haunt Italian naval strategy for the rest of the war. The Italian Navy had been built as a defensive force designed to control the Mediterranean through the threat of its battleships, but the British had demonstrated that battleships in port were not a threat. They were targets. By midday, Mussolini had been briefed. His reaction, according to those present, was explosive. He demanded to know how the British had achieved such success. He wanted explanations. He wanted someone held accountable, and he wanted the fleet moved immediately to a safer location. That last order came down to Campion within hours. Move the surviving battleships to Naples immediately. The harbor at Taranto was no longer considered secure. If the British could strike once, they could strike again. The order created immediate problems. The Later couldn't be moved. She was too damaged. She would have to be repaired enough to float properly before she could be towed anywhere. The Duello was in similar condition. Only the undamaged battleships could leave immediately. Campion ordered the Andrea Doria, Julio Cesare, and Vittorio Veneto to prepare for departure. They would sail that night under cover of darkness with maximum fighter cover during daylight hours. The risk of British submarines was high, but the risk of another air attack was deemed higher. As the orders went out, Campion composed his official report. The document would be studied by naval historians for decades. In it, he detailed not just the damage, but the implications. The attack demonstrates that capital ships in harbor are vulnerable to air attack regardless of defenses. He wrote, "The torpedo bomber, previously considered a minor threat, has proven capable of inflicting catastrophic damage. Our entire defensive strategy must be reconsidered." He was right, but the words felt hollow. Reconsideration wouldn't bring back the Conte di Cavour. It wouldn't undo the months of repairs facing the Il Torio. It wouldn't change the fact that the balance of power in the Mediterranean had shifted in a single night. In the harbor, salvage operations continued. Divers descended into the flooded compartments of the Conte di Cavour, searching for survivors and assessing damage. They found bodies. They found compartments crushed by water pressure. They found evidence of how quickly the ship had flooded. One torpedo had done all this. One torpedo, properly placed, had sunk a battleship. The technical lessons were being learned in real time. Italian engineers examined the torpedo damage and realized the British had solved the shallow water problem. Standard torpedoes would have buried themselves in the harbor mud before detonating. But these torpedoes had been modified to run at depths of just 10 or 11 men. They had struck the ships below the waterline, but above the harbor bottom. Perfect placement, perfect execution. They knew exactly what they were doing. One engineer reported to Campion, "This wasn't luck. This was precision." Campion nodded. He had already reached the same conclusion. The British had studied Taranto. They had planned meticulously. They had trained their pilots. They had modified their weapons. And they had executed a near-perfect attack. The Italian Navy, by contrast, had assumed their position was secure. They had assumed the British wouldn't dare attack. They had assumed wrong. By evening, the first detailed casualty reports arrived. 59 confirmed dead, over 600 wounded, many seriously. The numbers would have been worse if the ships hadn't been in port. Damage control parties had been able to respond quickly. Medical facilities were immediately available. If the attack had happened at sea, the loss of life would have been catastrophic. Small comfort. The dead were still dead, the wounded still wounded, and the families would still receive telegrams that would shatter their lives. Campion read through the casualty lists, names, ages, ranks: 23-year-old seaman from Naples, 37-year-old petty officer from Rome, 19-year-old apprentice from Sicily. Each one a life ended, each one a family destroyed. We failed them, he said to his chief of staff that evening. They were alone in his office. The sun had set. The harbor lights reflected off the oil-slicked water. We put them in those ships and told them they were safe. We were wrong. The chief of staff had no response. What could he say? The admiral was right. The strategic implications were becoming clearer as the day progressed. With 3 battleships out of action, the Italian Navy's battle line was reduced to 3 operational ships. The British Mediterranean Fleet, based at Alexandria, had 4 battleships. The balance of power had shifted. Italy could no longer guarantee control of the central Mediterranean. Supply lines to North Africa were now more vulnerable. Naval operations would have to be more cautious. Worse, the psychological impact was immense. The Italian Navy had been built on the assumption that its battleships were invulnerable fortresses. That assumption was now shattered. Every sailor knew what had happened at Taranto. Every officer understood the implications. The pride of the fleet had been humbled in a single night. In Rome, discussions were already beginning about how to prevent another Taranto. More torpedo nets, more barrage balloons, better anti-aircraft coordination, night fighter patrols, improved radar systems. All of it necessary. All of it too late for the ships already damaged. Cavanieri, the undersecretary, was already facing calls for his resignation. The disaster had happened on his watch. The defensive failures were his responsibility. He would in fact resign within weeks, replaced by Riccardi. But that night he was still in command, still trying to manage the crisis, still trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. His statement to Mussolini that evening was blunt. "The British have demonstrated a capability we did not believe they possessed," he said. "They have shown that our harbors are not safe. They have shown that our defenses are inadequate. And they have shown that the nature of naval warfare is changing. We must adapt or face further disasters." Mussolini's response was reportedly furious. He demanded immediate action. He wanted the British to pay. He wanted revenge. But revenge required a fleet capable of operating. And that fleet had just been crippled. Back in Taranto, as midnight approached, the harbor was still ablaze with activity. Repair crews worked under floodlights. Salvage operations continued. The undamaged battleships prepared to depart for Naples. And in his office, Campion drafted his personal assessment of the day. "We were unprepared," he wrote. "Not in terms of equipment, but in terms of mindset. We believed our position was secure. We believed the British would not dare attack. We believed our defenses were adequate. We were wrong on every count. The price of that error is 3 battleships, 60 dead, and a strategic position severely compromised." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "The British did not defeat us with superior numbers or superior technology. They defeated us with superior planning, superior training, and superior execution. They took risks we would not have taken. They attempted what we believed impossible. And they succeeded because they refused to accept our assumptions about what could be done." It was perhaps the most honest assessment any Italian admiral would make about Taranto. The British hadn't won through overwhelming force. They had won through audacity and skill. 21 obsolete biplanes had achieved what battleships and submarines had not. They had changed the strategic balance of the Mediterranean in a single night. The lessons of Taranto would ripple outward. In Japan, naval officers would study the attack carefully. They would note the shallow water torpedo modifications. They would observe the success of the night attack. They would recognize the vulnerability of ships in harbor, and 13 months later, they would apply those lessons at Pearl Harbor. But that night in Taranto, the focus was on immediate survival. Moving the fleet, repairing the damage, accounting for the dead, understanding what had gone wrong, and trying to figure out how to prevent it from happening again. As dawn approached on November 13th, Campion stood on the balcony of his headquarters one more time. The harbor below was quieter now. The fires were out. The rescue operations were winding down. The oil slicks still spread across the water, reflecting the early morning light in rainbow patterns. 3 battleships sat damaged in that harbor, the pride of the Italian Navy reduced to salvage operations and repair estimates, and somewhere to the north, the British carrier that had launched the attack was sailing away. Its mission accomplished, its aircraft safely recovered. They made it look easy, Campion said to the officer standing beside him. That's what bothers me most. They made it look easy. It hadn't been easy. The British pilots had flown through intense anti-aircraft fire. They had navigated in darkness. They had attacked targets in a confined harbor. They had faced barrage balloons and searchlights and every defense the Italians could muster. 2 aircraft had been shot down. 4 men had been lost, but the results made it look easy. 3 battleships damaged. Strategic balance shifted. Italian naval confidence shattered. All for the loss of 2 obsolete biplanes. The mathematics of that exchange would define Mediterranean naval warfare for the rest of the war. The British had proven that carriers could strike battleships, that air power could challenge sea power, that old assumptions about naval warfare no longer applied. In the weeks that followed, the Italian Navy would relocate its fleet. It would improve its defenses. It would become more cautious in its operations. But it would never fully recover from the psychological impact of Taranto, the moment when 21 British aircraft did what an entire fleet had not been able to do. Campion would remain in command, but his career would be forever marked by that night. He had not been responsible for the defensive failures. He had not chosen the inadequate torpedo nets or the poorly deployed barrage balloons, but he had been in command when the disaster occurred. That was enough. Years later, after the war, Italian naval officers would still debate what had gone wrong at Taranto. Some would blame the defenses. Some would blame the intelligence failures. Some would blame the strategic assumptions that had left the fleet vulnerable. But in the immediate aftermath, in those first hours after dawn on November 12, 1940, the Italian admiral said what any military commander says when facing an unexpected disaster. They asked how it had happened. They assessed the damage. They tried to understand what had gone wrong. And they began the long, painful process of adapting to a new reality. A reality where battleships in harbor were not safe, where old doctrines no longer applied, where the British had demonstrated capabilities the Italians had not believed possible. The morning after Taranto, Italian admirals learned that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war they were actually in. And that lesson, more than any specific tactical or strategic adjustment, would define Italian naval operations for the remainder of World War II. The harbor at Taranto would eventually be repaired. The later would return to service. The Duilio would be refloated and restored. But the Conte di Cavour would never fight again, and the Italian Navy would never again assume that position and defenses were enough to guarantee security. The British had taught them otherwise. With 21 aircraft in a single night, and the Italian admirals standing in their headquarters that morning, looking at damage reports that seemed impossible to believe, had no choice but to learn the lesson. Their fleet had been shattered. Their assumptions had been proven wrong, and the war in the Mediterranean had fundamentally changed. That was what Italian admirals said the morning after Taranto, not in grand speeches or dramatic pronouncements, but in quiet conversations, in damage assessments, in orders to relocate the fleet, in the recognition that everything they thought they knew about naval warfare had just been challenged, and in the understanding that the British, with their obsolete biplanes and their audacious plan, had just rewritten the rules of engagement.